Good afternoon, welcome everyone. This is the 115th CPR-CSH workshop and very happy to see you all here. Why don't you guys move front? There's nobody else in the room, lots of chairs. So very happy to have Nitin here today. Nitin is an urban researcher, artist and educator. He's currently based at ETH Zurich. And what he's presenting today is a part of his doctoral dissertation. It's a very intriguing title, Nitin, and I'm sure everybody is wondering what the Delirious city, why would you use the word delirious for Delhi and exactly in what context and how. I've been thinking, I mean, of course you've specified some of it in your abstract, but at the same time, it's a very particular word to use. And I'm sure you have good reason for it. But so Nitin has been doing field work in and around Delhi for the last couple of years and been working in this space before that, even before he started doing his PhD, and sort of been in touch on and off. So I'm as curious as the rest of you to know how so many years of observing and talking to people is crystallizing into academic work here. So I won't delay and handing over to you, Nitin. Looking forward to you talk.
Yeah, thanks Mukta, and thanks Partho and Mary Helen. She's not, and neither is Olivier not here. But yeah, thanks.
Traveling out of the country. Olivier is busy defending a particular research project we hope will look at the health of the city of Delhi, and we hope you'll be able to join us before we finish. So, depending on how lenient the government is with him, we shall hope we shall have a little bit of that. Yes.
So thanks for the opportunity to present here. And yeah, so what I'm presenting today is a part of like my ongoing fieldwork since the last 2 years in Delhi, in the region of Delhi. And it's sort of like it's observations, conclusions, and findings from this research. So it still needs a little bit of work, but it's sort of like ongoing work. A second thing I wanted to mention before I start is that it's a presentation about a city region. So I might be thin on some details, but I'm happy to talk afterwards in the discussion. And also if somebody wants to electronically write to me, I'm happy to share details. The title of the talk, which is also title of my PhD dissertation at ETH, Delhi Without Borders, is in reference to the explosive, conflictual, and contradictory urbanization or urban restructuration of Delhi into its region. It's not just a reference to the sprawl of agglomeration in the region, but often invisible processes of enclosure, of dispossession, and social splintering while the urban fabric of Delhi is extending in the larger territory. So simultaneous to the radical transformations that have been happening inside the city of Delhi to provide a spatial fix for transnational capital, there's also very important or profound processes happening in the larger territory, which sometimes don't deserve an equal attention. And what I've tried to do is I've tried to link the dots on the political economy of the making of the region of Delhi. So just to present a brief vignette of how the region looks like, and many of us don't have the privilege to actually go out of the city or don't like to do that. So there's a stark tapestry of disparities of sparsely occupied luxury condominiums popping up next to dense settlements of housing that are housing masses of labor migrants, of industrial logistical spaces set amidst remnants of agripastoral landscapes, of operational landscapes set within sacred ecologies, or also of new infrastructure networks set in bypass to the perpetually incomplete existing ones. So this process of territorial churning, it's sort of exposing the palimpsest of recent and historical past of agrarian and environmental ecologies, of social and political conflicts, and technologies of spatial regulation. So there's thus a very peculiar confluence of subaltern and planetary dynamics, of sedentary and nomadic practices, of urban and agrarian societies in the territory. My attempt in this presentation is to, and in the larger work, is to unpack these dynamics and to unpack these processes. So there's some really valuable research that's come out of CPR CSH collaboration through the projects of Indiapolis and subaltern urbanization. And what this has done is it has sort of visibilized the profound transformation happening in the agrarian hinterlands of India, and also opened up new sites and a new agenda for urban research, which is sort of like combines urban and agrarian studies. So this has, of course, been quite inspirational for me to look beyond the city a little bit. So if one is to look at the larger territory of Delhi, there's just like how these census towns and statutory towns are emerging from villages at the scale of the nation, there's also a large number of these village transformations happening in the larger region. And these transformations provide quite a good site to uncover the processes happening in the region through which this sort of urbanization is spreading in the territory. So what I've done is I've taken three of these sites, three of these transformed villages in the southwest section of Delhi region. So these are, the first one is Kapasera, which is located in the green belt that separates Delhi and Gurgaon. The second one is close to IMT Manesar. There's a village called Naharpur Kasan. And the third one is Bhiwadi, which has transformed from a village to a statutory town. So these places provide a good site to sort of like, what I've been doing is I've conducted multi-sited and multi-locational ethnographic research, ethnographic work through these places. So
where did you get this map from?
From someone in Kapased actually, who runs an archive. What's interesting is that it's not just jurisdictional regions that exist in the larger territory, but there are cultural regions as well, along which there's kinship ties. So the two of the villages that I'm studying, Kapaseda and Naharpur Kasan, they fall in this region called Ahirwal, and they are mostly Yadav villages. And the third one is actually the third village that I really did embedded research in is actually a Mayo-Muslim village, which is in Rajasthan but has a Mayo-Muslim Mewati community there. So they speak even Mewati. So it's in Alwar, but it has a different kind of community. So what's happening here, what I've done here is that I've used conflicts as an entry point. So what happens is when there's a conflict, if it turns legal or there's some sort of like visibilization of the entire chain of actors, processes, and networks. So I identified 9 conflicts along these 3 sites, and the vertical axes that I was using to identify these conflicts were land ecology, housing, and infrastructure. So, the sections that I would present later would sort of like dwell on these conflicts and would sort of extract processes and knowledge from there. But before I go on to present my empirical research, I wanted to just have a little bit of diversion towards discussing the spatial technologies that have regulate the region of Delhi. So I'm not sure, but I think most of you in the room are familiar with this plan. So this is the master plan of 1962, which is also referred to as the fourth plan for Delhi, which was, of course, not the first master plan for Delhi and definitely not the first post-colonial master plan, but it was quite, it had quite a strong legacy in introducing intertwining between Delhi and its region. So it was sort of, it emerged through the development assistance of Ford Foundation, and it was designed by a team of American regionalist planners. at a time when there was a high internationalism in planning. There was also quite influential work at that time by demographers like Kingsley Davis, who were predicting a stark metropolitan future for India. So they were predicting that Calcutta would have a population of 60 million, Delhi would be a 30 million plus city by year 2000. So there was a sort of a want for designing something that was regionalist against metropolitanist, which means that they wanted to decentralize Delhi by restructuring it in the region. So it was sort of a master plan that wanted to sort of find solutions to pathologies that come with sort of sprawling growth. So yeah, this and if I can quote from Kingsley Davis writing in India's Urban Future, he said, we may expect the center to remain static, and he's referring to Delhi here, or lose population while the periphery expands rapidly outward at a lower average density. While making urban life more tolerable, it will introduce difficulty in escaping the city that would take 4 hours to drive across. So there was like a very urgent need to do something about it. So the design at that time was to have 6 ring towns around Delhi. Gurgaon was one of them, and to contain the regional growth by distributing them in these sort of new ring towns. Of course, and Professor Ravi Sundaram, he writes quite eloquently in his book Parrot Modernities about the plan, and it's quite a detailed discussion. So I digress. I think it's quite it's written and discussed in quite detail. This was followed up by the institution of the National Capital Region Planning Board in 1985, and the first plan that came out in 1988, which was called the Ncr Master Plan of 2001. What you might notice here is that what happens is the previous ring towns become yellow, and then there are these new red regional centers that are proposed. So the idea was to restructure the growth further into the region through having agropolitan-like settlements, like Rivoli, Dharuheda complex, Panipat, and so on. And because at that time there was quite a lot of farmer distress because of because it came after the Green Revolution. There was also sort of a combination of agrarian and industrialization. Sort of, it was to service this agricultural hinterland. So while if you go to these parts of the region, if you go to Rivoli, for example, you would find layers of this agropolitan past. It was another profound plan that came in the 1990s that really radically redefined how the region is sort of planned and the logics behind urbanization in the region. So this little discussed plan was the plan for IMT Manesar, which was again a transnational exercise where the Japanese, it was sort of sponsored through JICA, through the Japanese International Cooperation Agency, and led by a techno consultancy firm from Japan called Yachiko Engineering. And the idea there was to spatialize the liberal economic order that was emerging at that time. So what was referred to as the future in the archive, in the planning documents that I studied in the archive, would essentially remove any barriers between local and export-oriented manufacturing, but also between industrialization and urbanization. So there was quite a hard intent on urbanizing without borders, so removing all boundaries to capital extraction, to investment. And yeah, I'm happy to share details here if anyone wants to. It's a more detailed discussion in my dissertation. But what emerged out of it and why it was cited in IMT Manesar, in Manesar instead of the 4 other sites that were proposed for it, is because it allowed the regional plan of Delhi, regional plan of Delhi allowed financialization for this plan for IMT. So the idea was to use IMT as a symbol for spatialization of the new economic order, and to financialize the regional plan to keep on extending. So if one is to if one is to go to Manesar today, it definitely, I mean, it's not contained. It's sort of not just IMT Manesar sprawls, but there's all kinds of other logics there. But what's interesting is since then, not only have the planning boundaries of the region expanded greatly in the successive regional plans, but also logics pioneered in IMT have allowed the land corridors to be spread. So the DMIC, for example, uses similar kind of logics which sort of financialize land corridors at a very extensive scale. Yeah, this sort of exponential urbanization and sort of GDP growth, urbanization as the driving force here. It's producing all kinds of conflicts, because the idea there was also to remove the use value from urbanization and to split it between profitable ventures that were to be developed by the transnational private sector and to black box unprofitable ones like workers' housing and waste segregation and so on. So it is, of course, it's urbanizing the larger territory, but it's also generating all kinds of conflicts that emerge through this black boxing and through this splintering. So this next section in my presentation has an intriguing title, Making Not Possible Hills into Possible Urban Land. It's inspired from the Rural Agrarian Register. So anyone familiar with the Rural Agrarian Register, there's 2 kinds of categories basically. So one is Gair Mumkin Zameen and there is Mumkin Zameen. So anything that's uncultivable is Gair Mumkin, or not possible. This includes, of course, the settlement space, but also, and more importantly, ecological commons. So Gair Mumkin Pahad, for example, which is not possible hills. Gair Mumkin Jod, which is a pond, river, forest, other things. So in the rural social system in the region, these ecological commons have been managed through ritualization and through sacredization. So this included sacredization of biodiversity. So like plant species like dhok, it's a tree which is considered sacred. Or also forest land, so like sacred groves called like orans and devbanis, or through also rituals and sort of annual fairs and festivals. In this southwest corridor that I'm studying, the major ecological corridor is, of course, the Aravali ecosystem that sort of stretches across. And in a lot of these villages, the land under the Ravalis or the Gair Mumkin Pahad is often larger than the cultivable land itself. And while there is sort of like active efforts to urbanize and monetize this farmland, there's also quite a lot of efforts to enclose the ecological commons as well. And by this, I don't just mean enclosures by pirate entrepreneurs forming sort of like ecological ecotourism complexes, but also through roads and through deregulation and through statecraft. So one prominent conflict that I'm following here is, of course, of the Aravali Biodiversity Park, which is sited on the Gair Mumkin Zameen or Gair Mumkin Pahad of Nathupur village, and is enclosed by by DLF City. So there was a mine had emerged here in the 90s to mine for aggregates and pit sand for the construction of Gurgaon and this part of the region. And then a court injunction sort of stopped that mining in the region, and it was ordered for renaturalization of this former mine. In 2008, a new collective, citizens collective at that time called I Am Gurgaon, it sort of took over the task of renaturalization, in which they involved ecologists, architects, sociologists, bureaucrats, corporates. So it was sort of like coming together, and the park was sort of planned as a reparative ecology, in which they intended to reintroduce plant species and native species of plants that were lost through the process of urbanization. So it was sort of like turning the clock back on biodiversity loss in a way. But the conflict here emerged through sort of when NHAI sort of announced a road, unsolicited road here passing through the park in 2018. And it sort of mobilized the civil society and people in Gurgaon to not only fight against the road building, but also to pose the larger ecological question in the region. So, of course, there were pledges made and online campaigns, signing petitions, and sit-ins and dharnas and whatnot. But also it was sort of proclaimed as a sacred forest for Gurgaon, which is sort of like a co-optation of this rural term for sacred groves. So finally, after much protest, the idea for the road was dropped, but I mean, it has resurfaced recently again, and you never know if it's going to get constructed, but until now, I think through my interviews and through my assessment, the Citizens Collective has been sort of on top of things, and they're taking care that it doesn't get built, the road doesn't get built. But as the plan for the road was dropped, another piece of statecraft or state legislature came into place, which is called the Plp Amendment, which was even more outrageous. What the Plp Amendment proposed is to take away the protections from Rivoli forests falling under the master plan of Faridabad and Gurgaon metropolitan. So now this is not a small piece of land. It's 600 square kilometers of forest. So soon the Save the Park movement became say no to PLPA and Save Our Forest movement. So there was sort of like a shift of scale where they realized that actually it's not just this park itself, but the larger ecology that is being harmed. So it's not only the extractive ecologies, extractive functions that are going further into the region, and there's like if you have a chance to visit Bhiwadi, and if you go in one of these Gairmungin Pahad or hills, it's quite bizarre because you might feel that the hill is still there, but if you go inside, it's like this, it's hollow completely. So it's extractive mining at another scale, which is sort of has its networks and things. But there's also another set of conflicts that are emerging through this large-scale ecological ruination of sorts. So on the one hand, there is sort of this fetishized pilgrimage landscapes that are emerging, that are enclosing at a very large scale these former sacred ecologies that are sort of fantasified and have like very big Ganesha and Shiva statues and whatnot. And on the other, there is also these old nomadic routes. So the Jhalori cows, for example, that travel every year 600 kilometers through the Delhi region around water cycles that are breaking up. So these nomads are actually becoming sedentary translocal populations within these Gairmungin Pahad. But On the other side of my case studies, in Alwar, there is another interesting rural ecological movement that's taking shape. So similar to Rivoli Biodiversity Park, there are other expressways, which I'll talk about later in another section, that are taking hold on the ground. And in Alwar, there is not just enclosure of ecological commons, but these coming of these expressways and these new buffer zone definitions, they're dispossessing a lot of communities. And what's happening in Alwar is quite interesting. Is they are sort of so the rural societies in these villages, they are collectivizing through the efforts of an ecological organization called Krapavis. And what they're doing is they are conserving these orans back and restoring them as a way of signifying that they're not ready for this change, or they would not like this change, and sort of presenting some sort of resistance to almost sort of a mindless urbanization of these hinterlands. So what Krapavis does is it runs this, apart from ground advocacy and conservation on the ground, they're also running this monthly newsletter called Dev Bani Baat, which translates into the voice of the sacred forest, in which they not only publish about how to conserve ecological commons, but they also publish a call for action for mobilizations against expressways and against dispossession. So what's happening in Alwar is quite interesting. So similar to PLPA, there are definitions around Sariska, for example. So there are new buffer zones that are created, and then in a few years after the communities are removed, they are deregulated and opened up for market. So it's sort of like a classical statecraft that's happening similar to PLPA, deeper in the territory. So in the next section, where I'm talking about bypass cities. So there's this sort of phenomena of almost these sort of bypass cities emerging in the region and the social splintering in them. So what I've done here is, because it's quite a lot of empirical material, I'm trying to sort of talk about one case, and which is the Dwarka Expressway, which is also called the Northern Peripheral Expressway, and Northern Peripheral Road, NPR. And it's a 28-kilometer expressway, which was proposed in 2006. At the same time as Commonwealth by Haryana government, that wanted to construct world-class extensions or world-class cities for itself. So it was sort of like it's sort of reminiscent of smart city era as well, where Haryana came and said, "Oh, we're going to build our own 20 smart cities." So it's sort of like it was a knockoff world-class city project in the wake of Commonwealth Games. So the road was announced in 2006, published in newspapers in 2007, and as soon as it was published, it mobilized a lot of people to resist it. And I'm just going to come to where the resistance came from. So once you enter Dwarka Expressway, by the way, which after 12 years, 13 years of inception is still incomplete and has no streetlights, it's sort of like a very bizarre island infrastructure which connects both to Delhi and Gurgaon through dirt tracks. So you have to literally go on a dirt track. So once you get onto the expressway, you're confronted with two types of advertising. So one is sort of this really micro-scale, small advertising boards, which advertise unauthorized residential plots, and facilitation of conversion of farming land into residential. And then the second one is sort of giant billboards and a lot of these real estate boys who would aggressively market you to buy a second or a third or a fourth or fifth home, which is sort of in a walled condominium style, really massive condominiums of 20,000 families or so. And it sort of like advertises sort of getting an escape, an oasis within this chaos of the city. So what happened is once the plan for the road was published, it mobilized the unauthorized colonies into action. So the unauthorized colonies of New Palam Vihar and Khedki Dola realized that actually the land that's shown green in the plan is where we are living, and they filed a sort of court in the High Court of Punjab and Haryana, but the Haryana state government said that not only have we not done ground surveys, but we would not compensate anyone because these are illegal, unauthorized, unequal even citizens of the city that vis-a-vis the condominium, people who are going to come in the condominium. So we don't want to institute a sort of unequal situation. But the response of the jury and the judges related to this was quite interesting, and I've been following the court proceedings, so the court documents that came out. And not only do the judges not only do they not question the idea and the concept behind the road itself, but they also really made questions about why has the city become so unequal that people have to actually adopt semi-legal ways to construct their basic homes. So finally, a sort of like compromise was achieved, and which was also quite interesting because the unauthorized colony had to prove social ties to the village on whose land they were. So finally, the compensation they received was to get rehabilitated really close to the village or to the expressway, because they were considered quote unquote like village dwellers, you know. So so these unauthorized colonies, which there's a lot also in the region, not just in Delhi. I mean, they form on the classical logic where the colloquially who's called colonizer is a local politician who develops his power from the land and exploits dual registers. So there's sort of like a Patwari register where ownership so there's multiple owners of 1 bigha zameen, and there's another parallel register which is the registrar's office where it's claimed that there's a house on the property. So these two registers, even if they are from state agencies, are neatly separated and they never meet until there's a conflict, like happened in here. So the 650 families that were falling on the way of the expressway, they finally got compensated, and they built their new homes not so far from the expressway. So but also what it did was it emboldened them to ask for more improvements. So if you visit the site now, it's quite interesting. So in this world-class city model, there was no small commerce planned. So what happened is where the demolitions happened, there's a whole series of small-scale commerce that's come up. People are now, the political agenda is about asking for authorization, for improvement, for sewage, for networked water, and so on. So, but it also had unintended consequence, the slowing down by the judicial system of the road. What it did was, and I don't know, I haven't seen this ever, but maybe in the room someone has, it sort of created a new type of welfare association, which was for the entire expressway. So these massive 89 condominium projects with 30,000 families each, they all came together to form a mega expressway welfare association, which represents 130,000 families and 89 societies. And what they've been doing is they've been sort of like pressuring, sitting on hunger strikes, asking for amenities. And now, finally, due to the pressure, there's networked sewage finally being laid down now as we speak, and there's an expedited road building process as well. So, So Dwarka Expressway not only epitomizes rather the compromise that the world-class city finally, the form that world-class city gets shaken into when it settles on the ground, but it also epitomizes another unsettling feature, which is sort of like the creation of whole bypass cities, which is not just happening at Dwarka Expressway, but at many places in the region and at many scales actually. So whether it be the eastern and western peripheral expressways, along which a number of cities have been proposed, 5 in Haryana itself, which includes Panchkaram Development Authority, a new city south of Gurgaon, which is even bigger than Gurgaon. Or it be the southern peripheral road, which is sort of like the mirror of Dwarka Expressway and the reason why the conflict emerged in Rivoli Biodiversity Park in the first place. Or it be this new $13 billion US dollar Delhi-Mumbai expressway, which is sort of meant as a bypass to the DMIC land corridor, which sort of would have a number of new towns and smart cities and logistical hubs. So in the opening, in the sort of launch for the expressway, I just realized that 2 of the leaders on the stage have died. Sorry. But on both sides of Nitin Gadkari. So when I was at the launch of the expressway in March of 2019, Nitin Gadkari it was also a time when they were transiting from NDA 1 to NDA 2. And so Nitin Gadkari, who's the transport minister, he was talking about how they've been building roads at the pace of 23 kilometers per day in their first tenure. And now they're going to increase it to 45 kilometers per day. So he was quite explicit also that this road building exercise, this exponential road building exercise is not just about the road. It's about creating cheap, urbanizable green land through dispossession. And what he mentioned was, it was quite interesting. His statements were quite interesting. So he was talking about how the savings that the cheap green land would bring to the project, the Delhi-Mumbai Expressway, are only a starting point. And these would exponentially increase through the construction of new logistical hubs, industrial township, and smart cities on this cheap land. So while this project is quite socially and environmentally quite disastrous because it's going to pass next to ecological hinterlands where there's a lot of reservoirs and a lot of forests and tribal communities and minorities. There is a sort of like a altruistic polishing on what's being done. So it's being portrayed as a project that would bring benefits of urbanization to these quote-unquote tribal hinterlands. Which is sort of like reminiscent of many developmental projects that are being pushed at the moment. So I'm now going towards the final part of my presentation, which is about the third type of housing that one does not experience from the roads, but if you go close to industrial areas, you will find former villages transforming into what I call tenement towns. So these tenement towns are actually where a lot of labor migrants live. So at the time of planning of the IMT and how the logic currently works is that it requires a lot of black boxing of labor housing. And actually Mukta has written a paper about typologies of labor housing in Gurgaon. And I think Tom Cohen from University of Bergen, he's also written about rentier capitalism in Gurgaon, and he mentions about these tenements. So what's interesting is the pattern in which they develop. So the land, agrarian land is first plotted similar to unauthorized colonies. Karkad colony, which is sort of a colony with tin roofs, it emerges as a first type to colonize this land. And then a stone slab colony emerges as an intermediate, followed by a final concrete colony in which there's almost 250 people in each of them. So they contain these almost standardized 3x4 rooms for labor migrants. So I think what I find interesting is that there is almost standardization. So you will find this in Kapaseda, you will find it in Bhiwadi, in villages close to Bhiwadi. So there's a standardization across region through kinship ties and through knowledge transfer and everything. So the building of the colonies and these tenement towns is actually quite a profitable business, and according to my calculations, it offers 300% rate of interest, which is quite high. But it requires a sort of black boxing and coalitions of these rentiers that run them. But also, more importantly, the colony or the space of inhabitation is only just the entry point. So there is other forms of exploitation or extraction that are run through them. So which is on everyday metabolism. So you have to pay exuberant rates on water, on the consumption of water, electricity. Even for your sewage, you have to pay a lot. But also there is a sort of housing contract is tied to consumption. So you have to consume from the grocery store inside these tenements. Another interesting trend is that due to the casualization of labor contracts, a lot of people in these tenement towns are actually multi-local migrants. So they combine work between industrial work in Delhi, in the Delhi region, with farming work in Bihar, somewhere in Bihar, or wherever they're coming from. And a lot of people move a lot of people move from Narayana. They are second generation labor migrants from Narayana or from Panipat. So they're also moving as jobs are moving, and also disappearing. So they also move when jobs disappear. So this is something that's happening in Naharpur, Kasan, one of the that actually a lot of people are moving away. But this, as I said, it requires this sort of really super profitable economy requires sort of compromises, and the cadastral plan, for example, develops as a planning document almost in these tenement towns. But also, I think something that's really intriguing, at least for me, is a sort of infrastructure of corporate compromise that developed here. So if you go in these tenement towns, you'll find a lot of water ATMs, and you'll find a lot of waste treatment, not waste treatment, but waste segregation, solid waste segregation plants and everything, all sponsored by corporates like Maruti, Minda, and everything. And so I try to understand what is why were they put in the first place. So I did a lot of interviews with CSR representatives from these companies and also the Gram Sabha people. And what emerged is that these infrastructures developed around the protests of 2012, the big Maruti protest. So the compromise that was achieved was that was for social control. So the rentiers develop a social control over people living in the village or the tenement town. And as a kickback, they get these like goodies or these small infrastructures, decentralized infrastructures. So it might seem philanthropic at first sight, but it's actually quite a big economy as well. So Maruti, for example, is spending $8 million in 15 villages in Manesar and Rohtak on these infrastructures. A second compromise, and here I'm wrapping up, is that which allows sort of this black boxing, is also a statistical one. So there's a large downplaying of numbers in these tenement towns. What I found is that the census figures in these towns cannot be trusted. So in Naharpur, Kasan, a village that I'm studying, the census or the official figure that the state even sort of puts its foot down, that it's actually just 10,000 people living there. But if you talk to the people in the village or in this town, people would say, quote, a number around 80,000, 75,000. And so what I try to understand is what is the source behind this number? And it's actually the primary health center data, which is counted on another methodology. So the census figure is counted on the number of households. So the people living in the tenements don't fall under a household category. So they're not counted in the census. So what happens in this primary health center data is that
It's not an institutional household, right?
yeah.
They're not allowed, the landlords don't allow them to count, basically. That's what I've heard at least.
I think it also,
It's an interesting point.
yeah.
How does it
Yes,
actually
sir.
happen
Our
in the
difference
census?
is 60%.
It's a very, so in Kapaseda also the difference is quite huge. So it's
All urban villages across the whole region, the differences.
yeah. So the methodology of the ASHA workers is also not super scientific, but it's actually quite approximate to actual counts. So the ASHA workers go from house to house counting the number of stubs. So, and they multiply the number of stubs by 4, which is also not an exact count, but approximate enough. So when I interacted with people from the primary health centers, what they revealed is that they realized quickly that they could not trust the census figure, and because they have to develop a sort of inventory of medicines, they have to have more precise counts. So they started to develop their own data. So now this data also, like the land figure, is also collected by the state, but never somehow meets. It stays as a parallel exercise, which allows these tenement towns, I would argue, to be black boxed and to maintain like a thin compromise that there's not a medicinal emergency breaking out, but yeah. So yeah. So I mean this is sort of like the portrayal of the city, but what I wanted to end with is some distressing calls that I've been seeing in this like ending part of my fieldwork in the last couple of days or 2 weeks actually, precisely. So there's some distressing calls that have started to emerge on the economic front. Newspapers are full of news such as 5 rupees Parle-G biscuits have become unaffordable for people from the rural areas and also the blue-collared urban workers. Simultaneously, there's a rise of unsold inventories of luxury houses and cars, putting millions of jobs at risk. So there's a lot of like jobs being lost in Naharpur, for example. And the Prime Minister's office recently ordered the NHAI to put brakes on the road construction, which is the most prized project, this kilometers per day. So it's asked them to put brakes on that and slow it down. And furthermore, there's signs of an impending climate emergency looming large over India. So all of these are pointers to a much heated economy that is burning out itself on an exponential land-based expansive logic. Between this, there are these emergent regional conflicts that offer liminal moments where the trajectory of growth or trajectory of urbanization can be radically altered. So this is something I wanted to end at. I really believe in thinking through place, and there was equally, and I'm doing my PhD in Zurich, and there was a equally profound moment at the beginning of the 20th century in Zurich where there were also stark inequalities, exponential growth through land, and the compromise or the solution that emerged there was municipal socialism. So they realized that they cannot, there's a power in the municipality that can be harnessed and to sort of decouple and again introduce use-based logics into urbanization. So I would end at that.